all began on a misty evening, the type that seemed to roll in unnaturally, as though called forth by some ancient force lying dormant beneath the tombstones. Highgate Cemetery, London's famed resting place for the elite and eccentric, had always been a hub for supernatural whispers. Tourists came for the Gothic allure of the architecture, the crumbling graves overrun with ivy, and the statues that loomed like sorrowful sentinels over the dead. But for some, it was more than just a curious attraction, it was a place of fear. Tom had heard the stories growing up in the neighborhood. His father, a gravedigger in the cemetery, often mentioned the figure. The dark stranger, he called it, as though naming it could somehow lessen its power. Every worker, every security guard, every groundskeeper had encountered the entity at least once, though no one ever spoke about it openly. Tom's father described it as a man cloaked in shadows, his features impossible to make out, who appeared at twilight near the oldest graves. "Don't make eye contact," his father warned once when Tom was no more than 8 years old. "If you see him, pretend you don't. He won't hurt you unless you acknowledge him." Of course, Tom had dismissed his father's words as superstitions meant to scare a child, something said to keep him from wandering the graveyard at night. As an adult, now in his mid-30s and working in the same cemetery, Tom scoffed at the notion of ghosts. But deep down, the fear lingered like an itch that wouldn't go away. Highgate Cemetery was a massive expanse of crumbling crypts, winding paths, and towering statues, some of which seemed to follow you with their eyes. On the day that Tom first encountered the figure, everything felt off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the air had a weight to it that evening, thick with something more than fog. He was finishing his rounds. Making sure none of the newer graves had been tampered with. Vandalism was a frequent occurrence. As the sun set, painting the sky with a blend of red and orange hues, he felt that familiar shiver run down his spine. That shiver, his father always said, was a warning. Glancing up from the graves, Tom saw him, the dark stranger, standing motionless near the path. He was close enough to see the figure's outline, dark and indistinct, but it was the eyes, or rather, the lack of them, that sent a chill through him. The figure had no face. Where there should have been features, there was only shadow. And though his father had warned him, instinct took over, and Tom's eyes locked onto the void where the stranger's eyes should have been. Time seemed to stop. The sound of rustling leaves, the distant hum of traffic, the faint chirp of evening birds, it all faded into a dead silence. The figure didn't move, but Tom felt an immense pressure building in his chest, like the very air had been sucked from his lungs. His limbs felt heavy, as if he were being pulled toward the entity, something urging him forward despite every instinct screaming to turn and run. A faint whisper echoed in his ears, though he couldn't make out the words. The language felt foreign, ancient even, as though it were spoken by something that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations. The whisper was pulling him in, and without realizing it, Tom took a step toward the shadowy figure. Suddenly, the sound of a crow's call pierced the silence, breaking the spell. The figure vanished in the blink of an eye, leaving nothing but the cold, eerie silence behind. Tom's encounter with the dark stranger left him rattled. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him home that night. He'd sit in his living room, lights dimmed, and swear he could see a figure standing in the shadows of the hallway, just at the edge of his vision. He'd blink, and it would be gone, but the sensation remained. Over the following weeks, strange things began happening at the cemetery. Visitors reported hearing whispers when no one was around. Statues were found facing different directions than they had been previously. And then there were the graves' newly dug earth disturbed, as though something had crawled out from beneath. It wasn't long before Tom began experiencing vivid nightmares. In them, he was always wandering the cemetery, lost in a labyrinth of crypts and headstones that seemed to stretch on forever. The dark stranger would be waiting at the end of each dream, faceless as ever, but this time, the whispers were clearer. "Come closer," they'd say, in a voice that was both inviting and terrifying. "Come closer and see." He'd always wake up before reaching the figure, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. But each night, the dream grew more intense, the pull stronger. Tom couldn't avoid the cemetery, not with his job on the line. He had thought about quitting, but something held him back. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity. What was the dark stranger? What did he want? The questions haunted him as much as the entity itself. It was a stormy night when Tom finally decided to confront the figure. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and his father's old revolver, a relic from his time in the war, he entered the cemetery after hours. The wind howled and rain battered the gravestones, creating an eerie symphony that set the perfect stage for his descent into madness. He found the dark stranger standing by an old crypt, one that had been sealed for over a century. As before, the figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, waiting. Tom could feel the pull again, stronger this time, urging him forward. With a shaking hand, he raised the flashlight, casting the beam onto the figure, but the light did nothing. It passed right through the shadowy form, as though it weren't even there. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Come closer, double quotes." Tom took a step forward, then another, until he was mere inches from the figure. He could feel the cold radiating from it, a chill that went straight to his bones. Then, for the first time, the figure moved. It raised a hand, pointing toward the crypt behind it. The door, which had been sealed shut for decades, creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness inside. And that's when Tom saw them, the eyes. They appeared within the darkness of the crypt, dozens of them, glowing faintly, watching him. The whispers filled his head, overwhelming his senses. "Join us," they said, in unison, the voices of the dead. Tom felt his body being pulled toward the crypt, unable to resist. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. Tom was never seen again after that night. His disappearance became another unsolved mystery, another legend added to Highgate Cemetery's dark history. Some say he was taken by the dark stranger, claimed by the cemetery's restless spirits. Others believe he simply lost his mind and ran away, driven mad by the whispers of the dead. But those who visit Highgate Cemetery after dark, especially near the old crypt, report seeing a shadowy figure standing nearby, a figure with no face, watching, waiting. And if you're unlucky enough to make eye contact, you might just hear the whispers too. After Tom's disappearance, his story quickly became the talk of the neighborhood. But what was more terrifying was not his disappearance, but the strange things that began to happen afterward. The people who worked at the cemetery gradually began to feel that something was wrong. They couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but Tom's presence, or rather his absence, seemed to leave a hole in the air. An eerie feeling hung over not only the cemetery, but also the surrounding residential area. Sarah, a new cemetery caretaker who took over after Tom's disappearance, began to experience sleepless nights, with nightmares similar to those Tom had described. In her dreams, she often found herself wandering among the graves, followed by an unknown shadow. Eyes stared at her from the darkness, and whispers echoed in her head, "Come closer." She thought it was just the pressure of her new job and the rumors making her paranoid. But as the dream progressed, it became more and more real, and she felt as if some invisible but powerful force was slowly pulling her into the darkness of the cemetery. Warnings in the night. One evening, Sarah decided to stay in the cemetery after work, trying to verify whether the strange things she had heard and felt were real. It was getting dark, and the wind blowing through the trees made everything cold. Although she was scared, Sarah was determined to find out the truth. She told herself that this was just a figment of her imagination, that nothing scary awaited her among the dusty tombstones. While checking the oldest areas of the cemetery, Sarah suddenly felt an unusual chill. She stopped, listening quietly, feeling that something unusual was around her. And then she heard footsteps, very light and far away, but clearly not hers. Sarah turned on her flashlight, scanning the nearby gravestones. Nothing, but the feeling of someone watching her from the darkness remained. She took a deep breath, trying to calm herself, but her heart began to beat faster. She remembered Tom's words, "Don't look him in the eye." But who was he, and why not? Then suddenly, from far away, between the tall, dense trees, she saw a figure. Just as the description had said before, it was a shadowy figure, no face, just a dark shadow with two empty eye sockets looking at her. This time, Sarah couldn't help it. She looked into the eyes of the person, and immediately, the whispering she had heard in her dreams became more vivid than ever. "Come here closer." Sarah tried to scream, but her throat felt like it was closing in. She felt invisible eyes watching her from all sides, making the air heavy. Each step seemed to stretch on forever, as if she were being sucked into an invisible vortex of darkness. She tried to back away, but the pull grew stronger, pushing her closer and closer to the shadow. In her despair, Sarah remembered Tom's story. She knew she was facing something that did not belong to this world, something that had haunted Tom and dragged him into the darkness forever. With a last effort, she closed her eyes and screamed, breaking the silence. The scream echoed between the tombstones, tearing the silence apart, and then, like magic, everything stopped. The shadow disappeared, and Sarah realized that she was standing alone in the cemetery, her heart pounding, but no longer oppressed by the darkness. She ran towards the cemetery gate, not daring to look back. From that night on, Sarah began to thoroughly investigate Tom's disappearance and the mysterious phenomena surrounding the cemetery. She discovered something strange. Everyone who had ever worked there had similar experiences. Strange dreams, a feeling of being watched, and most of all, the presence of the stranger in the dark, a terrifying secret buried hundreds of years ago. A noble family, who once owned a large part of the land in Highgate, performed ancient occult rituals to protect their power even after death. But the rituals summoned an ancient spirited dark entity that never left the human world. This spirit not only haunts graves, but also hunts those who dare or are naive enough to enter its territory. Sarah didn't know what to make of this discovery. But she knew one thing for sure: Tom hadn't just disappeared. He was drawn into the darkness of Highgate, along with the other souls who could not escape the haunting presence of that terrifying entity. Sarah decided to leave her job, to give up on her search for answers. But a part of her knew that the shadow was still watching her, that one day it would appear again, and this time it would not give her the chance to escape. Her dreams continued, even more vividly than before. The eyes in the darkness now knew her name, and the whispers were no longer an invitation. "You belong to us." And then, like Tom, Sarah disappeared into the rainy night. No one knew where she went. But at Highgate Cemetery, as night fell, shadows still passed over the gravestones. It is said that sometimes, if you look closely, you will see a female figure standing among the rows of graves, looking straight at you, smiling mysteriously, before disappearing into the eternal darkness. Soon after Sarah's disappearance, her story quickly became a local legend. No one was sure what had happened, but her mysterious disappearance and the whispers of the stranger in the dark had sparked fear in the community. However, a small group of people who were passionate about exploring mysterious places decided to find out. The group was led by Daniel, a paranormal researcher and YouTuber who was always on the lookout for horror stories that would attract thousands of views. Along with his friends Jess and Marcus, Daniel decided to investigate Highgate Cemetery, a place that no one dared to visit at night. They weren't the first to be curious about the strange events happening in Highgate. Many had tried before, but all had come back with unbelievable stories or simply given up after sensing the heavy, eerie atmosphere. But Daniel was different. He had a strong belief that everything had a logical explanation, and if there was a supernatural force, he would be the first to document it. On a cold, dark night, Daniel, Jess, and Marcus sneaked into Highgate Cemetery. They were fully equipped: cameras, EVP recorders, and powerful flashlights. Daniel took the lead, full of excitement, while Jess seemed more nervous and Marcus took the calm role, ready to protect the group if anything went wrong. Darkness enveloped them as they entered the cemetery. The wind whistled through the barren pines, making them feel as if thousands of invisible spirits were silently watching. Jess felt a shiver run down her spine, but said nothing, not wanting to scare Daniel and Marcus. "This is the area where Tom and Sarah worked," Daniel whispered, shining his flashlight into one of the ancient tombs. We'll film around here, try to catch any strange sounds or shadows, and see if anything comes up." As Daniel and Marcus set up their cameras, Jess began to sense that something was wrong. It wasn't just the cold air, but an eerie feeling as if something was slowly invading the space around them. "We should go, Daniel," Jess whispered. "I don't like this place." But Daniel just smiled and shook his head. "It's okay. This is a great opportunity to record something really creepy." As they began filming, something strange happened. Their recorders suddenly began to make a humming sound, like voices echoing in the distance, but none of them could hear anything clearly. Marcus paused, staring at the device. "What is that?" Marcus asked, picking up the recorder. "It's not wind, it's like someone whispering." Daniel smiled, clearly intrigued by the idea. "Great, this is exactly what we need." But Jess felt different. She had a feeling that something was very wrong. And then, somewhere among the old graves, she saw a shadow move by. At first she thought it was just the shadow of a tree, but then she realized it was the stranger everyone had been talking about. The image was all too familiar from the previous descriptions. A dark figure, faceless, with only empty eyes staring straight at her. Jess screamed, but when she turned around, she saw that Daniel and Marcus were still focused on their equipment, not paying any attention to her. "We have to get out of here," Jess yelled, trying to pull Daniel away from the cemetery. But Daniel refused, refusing to listen, ignoring her concern. "No, this is what we need, don't you see? We're about to record evidence of a real supernatural event." As Daniel finished speaking, the atmosphere around them changed. It was no longer just cold. The darkness began to move, closing in around them, as if an invisible force was getting closer, squeezing the space. Marcus began to feel fear. He looked around, seeing the dark figure approaching their group. This time, he could clearly feel the presence of the stranger in the darkness. Its empty eyes stared at them, and the whispering began to become clearer. "Come closer, come closer." This time, none of the group could resist the call. They could clearly feel the mysterious attraction, pulling them towards the endless darkness. Jess tried to scream one last time, but immediately, she felt as if she was blocked, unable to make any sound. Blackness enveloped everything. The next morning, the cemetery staff discovered Daniel's group's cameras and equipment, but there was no trace of any of the three. The police were called in, but found no evidence of what had happened. The final footage showed only a dark space, then suddenly cut off. Once again, Highgate swallowed up the unfortunate curious. The locals began to warn each other. No one dared to go near the cemetery anymore, especially at night. But there was one thing that no one knew. In the darkness of Highgate, ghosts still lurked among the graves. The empty eyes of the stranger in the dark still silently watched, waiting for the next soul to dare to enter his domain. And the cycle of Highgate, with mysterious disappearances and eternal darkness, continued without end. Although the official investigation has closed, not everyone is willing to give up their curiosity about the disappearance of Daniel, Jess, and Marcus. Among them is Amelia, an ambitious young reporter who is always eager to explore mysterious stories. For her, the events at Highgate Cemetery are an opportunity to unravel a larger mystery. Amelia has been following this story since the early days. She has researched every document related to the stranger in the dark, from word of mouth to old articles about similar disappearances that took place decades ago. But what haunts her are the small details, the scattered clues that no one seems to notice. Late one night, sitting among old photos and faded articles, Amelia makes a startling discovery. All the victims of the Highgate disappearances, including Daniel's group, have one thing in common. They had all reported seeing a faceless shadow in the weeks before the disappearance. Amelia recalled the account of a survivor of the previous disappearances. The man described seeing a faceless man dressed in black standing silently in the moonlight as he walked through the cemetery late at night. The witness was lucky enough to escape Highgate before something terrible happened to him. But Daniel and the others were not so lucky. Amelia decided to risk going into Highgate at night, something no sane person had dared to do since Daniel's group. With her voice recorder and camera, she wanted to experience it for herself and find out the truth about the mystery surrounding the shadow. That night, Amelia entered the cemetery, her heart pounding, but her composure unnerved her. The cold air of the cemetery immediately made her uneasy. The wind rustling between the graves, along with the dim moonlight, made everything seem dim and eerie. She walked deeper into the cemetery, each step leading her into another world. Each grave seemed to hold its own secrets, and she couldn't help but wonder how many invisible spirits were watching her from afar. When Amelia reached the area where Daniel's group had filmed the video, she stopped. Everything around her was eerily quiet. She took out her camera and started recording, but nothing special happened. No strange noises, no people appeared. Amelia almost started to think that it was all just baseless rumors. But then, from afar, she saw it. A strange black figure standing motionless in the moonlight, only a few dozen meters away from her. Her heart stopped. It was the figure of the stranger in the dark that she had heard about. There was no doubt about it. It was him. Amelia trembled, but curiosity and courage urged her to move closer. She took slow steps, her eyes never leaving the shadow. He stood still, his empty eyes staring straight at her, but there was no emotion. No anger, no joy, just a terrible emptiness. She raised her camera, started filming, her hands shaking so much she almost dropped the device. But as she started recording, the shadow suddenly disappeared, as fast as a wisp of smoke. Amelia panicked. She turned around, trying to find the shadow, but could no longer see it. The air around her suddenly became thick, as if everything was being drawn to a single point. And then, from right behind her, a whisper sounded. Closer dot, a dot, closer dot, a dot. Amelia turned around, but it was too late. A cold hand suddenly grabbed her shoulder, pulling her into the endless darkness. She screamed, but her scream was swallowed by the space around her. Everything became blurry, and before she knew it, the world around her had disappeared. She was dragged into the darkness. The next morning, Amelia's camera was found near the area where she disappeared, but no one could explain the last images on it. All it showed was a flickering film, accompanied by a buzzing sound, as if someone was whispering in the dark. No one could determine the source of the sound, but it sounded like a creepy invitation from the underworld. Amelia was never found. Rumors of the stranger in the dark at Highgate continued to spread, with haunting and terror everywhere. No one dares to enter the cemetery anymore, and the story of the unfortunate intruder remains an unsolved mystery. Amelia was never found. Rumors of the stranger in the dark at Highgate continued to spread, with haunting and terror everywhere. No one dares to enter the cemetery anymore, and the story of the unfortunate intruder remains an unsolved mystery. But among the ancient and gloomy tombs, the stranger in the dark still exists silently, waiting for the next victim. And once he has been seen, no one can escape the vortex of horror that Highgate Cemetery has swallowed so many souls. Amelia's disappearance is just the latest chapter in the endless story of this place, a place where darkness truly reigns, where death and eternal existence are one. After Amelia's disappearance, the story of Highgate Cemetery and the stranger in the dark became more famous than ever. Local and international media continuously reported mysterious disappearances, from Daniel's group to Amelia's, making Highgate Cemetery the focus of fear and creepy rumors. People around the area gradually avoided this area, and those who love to explore historical sites no longer dare to go near it. But with each terrible incident, there are those who are bold or curious to explore this mystery for themselves. Meanwhile, no one knows that an independent investigation team is secretly monitoring all these events. Funded by a private organization, this team is made up of experts in paranormal phenomena, spiritualism, and scientists who dare to face the unexplained. James, the leader of the team, is a veteran researcher with many years of experience investigating mysterious phenomena around the world. He had heard stories about Highgate for a long time, but Amelia's disappearance was the final push that made him decide to investigate directly. Joining him were Dr. Clara, a psychologist who specializes in paranormal phenomena, and Mike, an expert in recording devices and magnetic energy detection. They quietly set up a temporary base near the cemetery, with modern machines and infrared cameras to collect data around the clock. James' team spent many nights waiting outside the cemetery, trying to record any strange phenomena. On a particularly quiet night, when everything seemed to be plunged into deep darkness, they began to detect unusual signs. Mike's thermal imaging camera suddenly recorded the movement of a humanoid figure a few dozen meters away, but strangely, the surrounding temperature suddenly dropped as if there was a cold source of energy moving in the darkness. The group rushed to the monitor. The shadowy figure of the stranger began to emerge from the darkness. It was no ordinary human figure. No face, no normal movements, just a floating figure, as if it existed between two worlds. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She began to realize that all the descriptions of the stranger were not just stories of fantasy. There was a supernatural presence at Highgate, and perhaps it was not just a random phenomenon. James decided to do what no one had dared to do: approach the stranger directly. With recording devices and cameras, his group bravely advanced forward. As they walked deeper into the cemetery, the air around them became heavier, as if an invisible force was pressing down on them. Suddenly, all of their recording devices were jammed. Eerie sounds came from the speakers, like distant whispers. But what made the group shiver was that the whispers were so clear: "Go, or stay forever." Mike hurriedly checked the equipment again, but everything still couldn't function properly. This had never happened before in previous investigations. Clara began to worry, her eyes scanning the surrounding trees and graves, trying to find a sign of a presence. But then they saw it. From the darkness, the stranger in the dark gradually emerged, clearer than ever. The figure was no longer a blurry illusion, but a concrete entity, standing before their eyes. There was no face, but those invisible eyes seemed to be watching James's every move. Suddenly, the space around them seemed to shatter. The wind howled, and the surrounding graves began to shake. Mike shouted, telling the group to run. But as the three tried to turn around to leave the cemetery, they felt a strong pull from behind, as if something invisible was trying to drag them into the endless darkness. James felt a cold chill envelop his body. He looked ahead, where the exit was fading before his eyes. Clara was also struggling with the invisible pull, her eyes filled with fear, but she refused to give up. Finally, with a desperate effort, they broke free from the entity's control, ran out of the cemetery, and did not dare to look back. After escaping Highgate, James' group returned to their base, panicked but still not giving up. What they recorded from that night was undeniable evidence of the existence of the stranger in the dark. Although it was just a blurry image and a distorted sound, the data was enough to make anyone shudder. James knew that the truth about Highgate Cemetery was not just a scary story. There was something bigger, deeper, hidden in the darkness. And although they escaped that terrible night, the haunting of the stranger would haunt them forever. The final question still remained: who will be the next victim of the stranger in the dark? Highgate continues to be a terrifying place, where truth and mystery blend together in a never-ending spiral, leaving a shadow that haunts forever. Although they had left Highgate, the ghosts of haunting memories continued to haunt James, Clara, and Mike. They returned to their daily lives, but none of them could forget the suffocating and chilling feeling that the stranger brought. They met regularly to analyze the data and discuss their next plans. One night, while they were reviewing the video footage from the recording device, Clara suddenly pointed at the screen, her voice trembling. "Look, there's something moving here." They all fell silent, waiting for the shadowy figure to appear. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared, not only standing still, but also starting to move towards the camera. This time, they could hear a voice clearer than ever. "Seek the truth, but don't forget the price." Their breathing became heavy. Each word echoed in their heads like a warning, forcing them to consider their motives. Are they truly ready to delve deeper into the mystery, or will the price be too high? Unable to live in fear forever, James decided to return to Highgate once more. He believed that only by confronting the stranger directly could they solve the mystery and save the next victims. Clara and Mike, though apprehensive, eventually agreed to join. Before returning, they prepared a series of more advanced equipment, including energy sensors and advanced audio analysis equipment. James wanted to collect as much data as possible to understand the entity they were about to face. That night, they returned to the cemetery, filled with both excitement and determination. As the flashlights illuminated the ancient graves, the atmosphere around them seemed thicker than ever. They began to move toward where they had last encountered the stranger. In the very place where the memories of the stranger still haunted them, they retook the same position they had been standing. James felt a cold wind blow by, like an invitation from the other world. Suddenly, their recorders started to sound, the sound echoing among the graves, making their hearts pound. "We're back," Clara whispered, her eyes wide, fear and determination mingling. Suddenly, the familiar shape of the stranger emerged from the darkness, clearer this time, closer. The shape hovered, but there was no face, just a formless void of darkness. James knew they were nearing a decisive moment. "Why?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the silence. "Why kidnap innocent people?" The stranger was silent, but its eyes, though invisible, seemed to be directed towards them, as if it were hearing every question, every pain of those who had disappeared. Suddenly, a powerful light burst from their devices, reflecting the darkness. All three of them, in that moment, felt a strong connection to each other and to the world around them. Clara began to speak, trying to use the power of her mind and will. "We are not afraid of you. We came here to understand, not to fight." It seemed that her words had an effect. The stranger's form wavered, as if struggling with something inside. A tense moment passed, and then, like a calm wind, it began to fade. James, Clara, and Mike felt a sense of peace at the same time, as if the darkness was lifting. They no longer heard the whispers or felt the chill. Everything seemed to be quiet. After their terrifying experiences, James and his group decided not to return to Highgate. They had gathered a lot of valuable data, but more importantly, they had come to understand that there were things that could not be forced into explanation. While the stranger was still unclear, one thing was certain: people like James, Clara, and Mike had shed light on a deep secret. They could not save all the victims of the past, but they could help others not have to go through the same pain. Ultimately, the story of Highgate Cemetery and the stranger in the dark lived on, becoming part of the legend. And while no one may know the complete truth, at least they dared to face the darkness instead of running away from it, and that was the light at the end of the tunnel they had been searching for.